Okay, good morning, everybody. Um, I hope I'm audible enough. Welcome to this session. Uh, it promises to be very enlightening and interesting. I would like for us to um, endeavor that we are on mute. I've tried to mute everybody, and I also plead that we wait for like 5 minutes while Elesie joins us. Hello, Karen. Can you hear me? Hello, Elesie.
Hello.
Okay, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Great.
Good
Yeah.
day.
Good
Thank you
day.
for joining us. Yeah. So, before we start, I think I will just quickly run through the etiquette for today's meeting before we start. Um, and then after that, I would introduce our guest speakers for today and then move on to other things. And then we can start the session. Okay. So for the meeting etiquette, um, please, we don't want you sharing the link with just anybody, in as much as we want a number of people to attend this event. We just want to be careful so we don't have hackers in our midst. Endeavor to mute yourself while speaking. I've tried to mute everybody, and do not speak until you are called upon. I would unmute if you need to ask any question. Please get attention by raising your hand or commenting in the chat box. If you have any questions, please use the chat box or the question and answer functions. Then also use the chat box for communication purposes on YouTube as well. Uh, Endeavor to pay rapt attention and try not to disrupt us. Thank you once again for attending this session, and I know it's going to be very enlightening. I will just quickly introduce our guest speaker. Our guest speaker is by the name Elesie Ezenwanne. Elesie is a well engineer with Shell Nigeria Exploration and Production Company and has over 8 years deep water well engineering experience in drilling, completions, and well interventions. Her experience spans across well operations, front-end design, operational and business performance improvement, and project maturation. She holds a bachelor's degree in petroleum engineering from the University of Port Harcourt and a master's degree also in petroleum engineering from Heriot-Watt University, UK. She's also an active member of the Society of Engineers and has contributed to the body of knowledge through her technical paper titled Structured Benchmarking Approach for High Complexity Wells, a case study for Bunga wells. Um, Join me in welcoming um, Elesie Ezenwanne, and she will be taking us through this webinar session titled An Integrated Approach to Well Planning. Welcome, Elesie.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Adako, for that introduction, and
Thank you so
thanks everyone for joining this session. I'm currently sharing my screen. Please confirm you can see my slide.
I can see it clearly.
Okay. Okay. Great. And my audio is good.
Yes. Okay, I would just like to say to the audience, please, if you can't see the slides or her audio becomes maybe bad or shaky, please kindly comment in the chat box and we would let her know. Also, if you have questions, just kindly drop it in the chat box. We will take questions after the presentation. And then, if in the process of the presentation she answers your questions, I think that would be way better. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Aldaku. So I'll really be leaning on you to let me know if there are any comments. Because as I'm sharing my screen, I would not be able to monitor the chat box. Okay,
No
so
problem.
please do prompt me if there are any critical times when you cannot hear me. But confirm that my audio is good right now.
It is good. It is good.
Okay, fantastic. I would also try to share my video as well. And if our network starts to fluctuate, please also shout out, and I'll be willing to turn off the video. Okay.
No
All
problem.
right. So thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I'm excited to be sharing my own thoughts around how we should plan wealth from an integrated perspective. And it's a pleasure to be
Okay. Hello, Elesie. Hello.
speaking with
Okay, I think
you
you're breaking a bit.
to ask in the room what when we have.
Hello, Elesie. I
I'm
think you're.
breaking a bit.
Yeah, probably because
Okay.
of
All right.
you. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I will just connect my headset. I expected that actually. So okay, hello.
Hello, I can hear you.
Hello.
Hello, I
Okay,
can
is
hear you.
this better?
No, it's still breaking on my end.
Okay, great. All right. So thanks. Confirm it's from me or it's your network. If there's someone else that can confirm via the chat box, can you hear me clearly?
Please, if you can hear her clearly, kindly just comment on the chat box.
Breaking before, but I hear you clearly now.
Okay,
Okay,
okay, great. Thank you.
okay.
So I was wondering how many people, the demographics of the people we have on the call. What's our profession? Do we have geologists? Do we have drilling engineers in the house? Do we have completion engineers? Do we have reservoir engineers? Please, if you can, indicate your expertise in the chat box. That would help me gauge the demographics of the people we have on the call. So for reservoir engineers, you can just put RE, geologist. Okay, I'm seeing some responses.
Geologist.
Okay, so please
Okay.
let's keep that coming. Okay, I see we have more geologists. I see we have about 18 people on the call, expecting more responses. Okay, geologists. Okay, we have some drilling and completion engineers in the house. Great. We have petroleum economists. Fantastic. Adaku. We have a petroleum engineer. Okay. We have geologists. Okay. Okay, great. We have a reservoir engineer.
Reservoir.
Fantastic. We have reservoir engineers in the house. Okay, okay, that's really great. So that gives me an idea of the pool of expertise. We have geoscientists as well. Great. The pool of expertise that we have in the house. And I'm hoping that at the end of this session, we can really learn from each other's expertise in terms of how we contribute to the overall well planning process. I would just like to put up a disclaimer. Whatever I show here or say here, it's completely my own perspective. It does not represent what Shell believes it may represent, but it's completely my own views of um, um, and thoughts around an integrated approach to well planning. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So it's good to know the pool of expertise we have in the room. Like we've said before, we have geologists, we have reservoir engineers, we have petroleum engineers, we have drilling engineers. We even have people that have both drilling and completions expertise, and we have completions engineer. So for me, I basically started off as a completion and well intervention engineer, and transitioned into drilling. So I basically have some expertise and experience in both aspects, but of course, been working in a multidisciplinary team. And that's why I have a passion around, being integrated as a team to jointly deliver um, an expected outcome from a well planning perspective. So we're all experts.
Hello. Hello, Elesie. Hello, Elesie. You're mute.
I think she got knocked off. I'm trying to
Yes,
call her.
yes. Okay, okay.
Yeah, yeah, I'm here. I was actually speaking and it seemed like I was muted.
Yeah, I guess you were muted.
Okay, I will turn off my video because it seems like that may also be impacting
Yeah,
the network. Okay, so I will turn that off, and then maybe during the Q&A, I can turn that on again, just to enable that interaction between us all. Okay.
okay, that's okay. You need to share your screen.
All right. So can you still see my slides?
No, no. You probably need to share it again. Okay,
Is
hold
it
on.
up now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, all right, great. Yeah, apologies for that. So, like I was saying, I have an idea of the expertise we have in the room, and as experts, we seem to be all knowing, and I'd like us to reflect on some of these questions that I have up on the screen. Have you ever had to deliver your professional goals without the help of another? Maybe another expert also in your field? Have you ever been faced with a constraint that challenged to probably advise you on your area of expertise? So these are questions that I think that are the bedrock to the rest of the conversations that we'll be having this session. So we'll look at objectives of well planning. So the objective of planning a well is to deliver a safe, and quality well that meets the needs of the life cycle requirements of the well. Of course, with regards to oil and gas, or of the opportunity from well placement all the way to design, construction, and finally production, which is the end goal of the well planning process. Of course, this in order to deliver a good well plan, you need to have take on variables from different achieve these objectives for well planning. Unfortunately, it's not always possible to accomplish these objectives of having a safe well, having a quality well, or having a well that is delivered at a minimum cost, or even having a well that has the least duration in constructing. And that is always impossible to accomplish all of this, simply because there are several constraints available in our various disciplines, based on maybe the geology of the location, maybe based on the surface location, or even based on the drilling equipment constraints, or even casing limitations that prevent us from fully achieving all these four key objectives that I've highlighted. And you find out that what makes a very good well plan is a good understanding of what is most important to that particular well that you would be planning. And that is where we'll then have to start prioritizing on these various objectives. Of course, it's important to highlight that safety is a non-negotiable. So most of the priorities are around quality, delivery, and of course cost. And here, quality could mean intersecting, maximizing your exposure in the reservoir. It could also mean ensuring that you have a very clean well, or it could even mean data acquisition. So it all depends on the objective of the key objective, I would say, of the well plan. So there's a typical well planning process, I would say, which starts off with first understanding the well objectives. I had highlighted earlier, there are several objectives that can be the focus of any well plan. Um, then we have the wellbore trajectory planning. Once we're done with that, we have the risk and offset well analysis, very important, especially when we have very limited data and there are several uncertainties that we have to deal with. Then having a look at our history is then important to help us frame up the assumptions that we make going forward. Then we have the casing setting depths. And of course, after that, we develop our drilling fluid plan, the cementing plan, and lastly, the detailed well design, which seems to be focused more on the core day-to-day front end design for a well engineer. So this process that I've highlighted here is a simplistic process which focuses on the conceptual aspect of well planning. And of course, there are several input data required for us to go through this entire process, from the pore pressure to the subsurface targets to the data acquisition plan, even the location map, borehole stability data, a whole lot of data required through this entire process. And our ability to fit those data and know where they are required is absolutely important throughout the entire process. So we'll go on step by step. The very first step is understanding the well objectives. Okay, so there are several objectives that a well can have depending on the type of well. You could have a development well that seeks to achieve minimum capex, or seeks to achieve minimum OPEX, or seeks to achieve a maximum production. Sometimes maximum production may not necessarily always be the key objective for the well, especially in the current environment that we find ourselves in, where there's a need for cash preservation. So cost seems to be driving some projects right now. We also have it could also be early revenue. Okay, so that is where schedule plays a key role to what is most important for that well. Also, for wells that are exploratory wells or appraisal wells, it may not even be capex or opex or even production or even early revenue. It could just be, let's discover as much reserves as possible. Let's increase our reserves portfolio. So in this process, it's important that our various teams understand, what is most important for the well at every point in time. For a development well, critical to understand what that means. For an exploration well, discover reserves, which could translate to heavily data acquisition dependent well. Of course, in that case, cost will not then be a key driver for achieving the objective of the well. In this process, well engineers are sometimes accused of constructing, the cheapest or the quickest wells instead of the wells with the most valuable functional requirement or functional performance. It's important that teams have a shared objective when planning the well, and that is very critical as the very first step through the entire process, because this is what will drive the behaviors of the team, including the well engineers, throughout the entire process. Okay, so the next step basically is trajectory planning. So the planning the trajectory of the well, yeah, and in order to plan this, several parameters or data are required. For example, the location map is required. The well engineer needs to understand know the location and the site from which the wells will be drilled. The well engineer also needs to understand or have information on the exact coordinates, the surface coordinates for the well, and of course the subsurface
Hello.
target. So it's really is essential for designing a vertical well, or if by the surface coordinates as well as the subsurface coordinates. Speak.
No, I wasn't hearing you for a while, so I just wanted to say that quickly.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, it's better now.
Okay, all right. So you'd see here on my slide what I would call the perfect 2D well. I would call this the well engineer's well, right? Because it's low tortuosity, it has no collision risk, although you wouldn't see that in this picture. For those that may not be familiar with, a typical trajectory, so this is the cross section, the section view of the trajectory with the surface location at this point and the subsurface target at this point. So basically, like I said earlier, the surface location and the subsurface target drives the profile of the well. And from a plan view, if you're looking from top, this well, there are no turnings on this well. It's just a simple J well build up, and with you'd see at the end here in the reservoir section, there is actually no build. It's just a tangent section in the reservoir section. This is a perfect well engineered well, I'm usually excited to see wells like this. And to my right, you see what I call the geologist's well. Okay, and I don't mean any harm when I say that. We would also see that much later in the course of this session, a case study where this well was utilized to achieve the objective of the entire. This trajectory was utilized to achieve the entire objective of the well. So you'd see for a geologist, well, what I would say, you'd see highly tortuous, 3D well. Yeah, from the plan view here, a lot of build, drop, and turnings, and something to highlight for this particular well is that we had up to 6 degrees dogleg severity for this well, and of course collision risk with up to four nearby wells. And it's for the geologist. The geologist is unable at the time that a geologist would give us the target location. He or she is unable to see what the through profile of the well would be. Sometimes would receive up to three different, for this particular well, we received up to like four different subsurface targets that we needed to intercept, and that's why you see a lot of these turnings and the drop offs and the build up on the well. Okay, and of course the geologist is unable to see if there are any collision risk with nearby well. A typical, except in and on these days where maybe we're having integrated softwares that enable the teams to visualize all other wells within the location and be able to utilize the right criteria to ascertain if there are any collision risk with nearby wells.
Hello,
Which
hello.
ones pose collision. Trajectory planning, compartmentalized reservoir key locations in the subsurface.
Yeah, you were breaking. We lost you for a while.
Hello, Ada,
Like,
can you hear me?
no,
Okay,
you were
wow,
breaking. I had
interesting.
comments that the sound is breaking. Yeah, I couldn't hear you for a while, but I think it's better now.
Okay, all right, great. Apologies for that. So other challenges that we face, of course, we have fixed surface location. Sometimes we have surface locations where you have some buildings. For land location, you could have a building in the sweet spot of your surface location. For a deep water well, it could be that you have other installations there, or you could have limitations with regards to the manifolds that are free for you to plan your well through. And that leads to very highly complex wells, sometimes extended reach wells, due to the fixed location. And of course, sometimes geologists partners move the subsurface target due to maybe the uncertainties, or also due to lack of very sweet spots where they can locate the subsurface targets. Other challenges that are faced in this phase, like I mentioned, is the collision risk with existing wells. So, as part of the trajectory planning process, the well engineer would perform an anti-collision scanning to see if there are offset wells or nearby wells to which there poses some kind of collision risk with, and you then have to bring in some mitigating measures. Sometimes from the trajectory planning, it shows that you are actually colliding with the well. In such situations, it would be advised to revisit the entire trajectory. And then, lastly, some challenges with the presence of some complex geology, for example, faults. So, this particular well, we were trying to, there were about, there was a fault block very close to the well. So, we tried to avoid planning the well parallel to the fault line, and that's why you have this sort of like a pregnant sort of a trajectory. Okay, so right after the trajectory planning, like I mentioned, you have very limited data. So
Hello, hello, Elesie. Hello.
sometimes we have to
We lost you again. We lost you
rely
again.
on the history of the location. We look for fields or even analog
Hello,
wells. Can you
Elesie.
hear me now?
Yes, I think you're back on now. It's season and coming back.
Oh, okay. But am I currently sharing?
Yeah, you're sharing. I can see your screen, and I
Oh,
think it's better now.
oh, okay, okay, great. I'm not sure why.
If you can rewind back a bit, I think we lost you for a while. So,
Okay, at what
that
point did you lose me?
when you started with the risk and offset well analysis, when you,
Okay, okay,
yeah,
okay, great. I just started on that.
yeah,
Okay, so like I said, due to uncertainties or
hello,
lack of data,
it's breaking
um,
seriously. Breaking.
due to okay, this is really so. Let me see if I can
Hello,
connect to a different improves. Okay, did you hear? Hello, Ada. Hello.
hello.
Yeah, did you get me? Did you hear me? Okay, I will just type in here. Okay.
Hello, Ada, are you there? Okay, so let's just give Alessia about 2 minutes to reconnect to her new another network. So hopefully we have a better experience. Apologies about the network issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Uh, Ada, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so just before Alessia comes back up, uh, on behalf of the EAGE team, I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining the session today. And if you don't follow us currently on any of our social media platforms, please endeavor to follow us so you are aware of our activities coming up, such as this. And then we have some activities lined up for this month already. We are going to be having the monthly EAGE quiz towards the end of the month. And we have another webinar coming up on the 17th of October titled Geosteering Industry Best Practices, Falls and Solutions, 2 p.m. on the 17th. And the speaker is Kunle Bolomobe. He's a well-site geologist at Total. So just make out time, follow us on all our social media platforms so you're aware when we have these activities coming up. So I think Alessia is back up now. So Alessia, please share your slide. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. All right.
Please,
So let's
um,
hope this particular network remains steady through the presentation. Apologies for the disruptions. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, great. So I will start all over from the offset well analysis. I believe that was where we started having some break in in the network. Is that correct, Adaku?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, all right, great. So for this phase, the risk and offset well analysis, I was saying that due to the uncertainties and lack of data within a location, there might be a need to look at the history of the location in terms of analog fields or analog wells that are representative of the well or the well or even the field that we are developing. And the term offset well actually refers to wells that are geographically, closest to the proposed well location. We had earlier looked at the well bore trajectory planning. So for an offset well analysis perspective, as a well engineer, I will be looking at wells that are, within the geology that I will be intercepting for the well that I'm planning, or wells that are very close to the well that I'm planning in terms of the proposed location. And this offset well analysis is a critical step, and it's actually what can make a difference between a well that is abandoned or a well that is finally on production, because it helps you identify problem areas, early enough so that that can be addressed in the planning phase. It will help you identify all events that may influence the well design. For example, your offset well analysis could reveal that wells that are closest to the proposed well location, that you might have some shallow gas present, so you would need to revisit your entire plan to cater for that. It might also reveal that the region is prone to borehole stability issues, so you need to consider that as well. It can also help you identify good practices that should be continued in terms of if you've had borehole offset wells issues, or you could see if the practices employed during the drilling of those wells or even the planning of those wells, if those were sufficient or not. It can help provide the necessary information for you to conduct a risk analysis. Like I said, it's still tied to the very first one with regards to problem areas. So if you have wells that are drilled close to faults, then it needs to come out as part of your risk analysis, for which you need to have a mitigating measure for. It can also provide a means for performance benchmarking. Okay, so if you have several development wells, start even at this stage to already sense check what the cost of the well could look like. It can help you identify constraints and, of course, areas for opportunities. And lastly, it would help you validate some of your assumptions, because assumptions are usually made when you have very limited data. So having to analyze the analog of the well that you're planning to drill will help you, make very realistic assumptions that are not overly conservative or overly relaxing, basically. So the diagram you see here is just a snapshot of a location, the proposed location is the location in red, and then you have several wells that have been drilled in that region, which can serve as offset wells. And some of the key things that within the same geology, you could look at offset wells. And some of the key things that within the same geology, you could look at very old wells of more than say select years. You could look at, also important to look at, select which offset wells to analyze, could recent wells, because practices would have changed over time as well. Okay, so this is an example of some tight spots, some losses that can help you as the well engineer to begin. Okay, so this is an example of how to plan for that risk materializing. You begin to look at certain well that I easy to be in equivalent set plate intensity, or even look at your drill string design at this point when you start seeing tight spots all through there, any borehole stability issues. And it's really this offset well analysis is really important analysis, I would say, is one of the most important aspects of pre of it is beneficial to both the well engineer, the geologist, even the petrophysicist as well. Example of an offset well analysis. This is a better representation that were encountered for this particular well according to the depth. So that here analysis, this particular well according to the depth, so that details to know which geology or which depths are very prone to, say, tight spots. So this offset well analysis represent tight spots experienced, or in some cases sidetracks. Most times, not managed properly can actually lead to a sidetracked well. So this is really important for a well engineer to plan their well. The next, determining the depth to which you would set the different casing strings that will be run into that will be designed into the well, and of course, with the knowledge of the potential risk of the well from the offset well analysis, that can also drive, where the mitigate some problem zones, or even presence of shallow hazards. Of the casing certain depth phase as well is the pore pressure fracture gradient margin. In fact, this is really important to the overall well design, and it's almost like the starting point of how the outcome of the well would look like. The pore pressure provided by the reservoir engineer, the formation strength provided by petrophysicist. It's really critical here. Also, the formation prognosis, knowing what depths, which formations are going to be encountered and at what depth is really important, including the fluids composition of those various intervals are critical to the entire casing setting depth. Also, key consideration include the length of each whole section. So for some regions, it's been ascertained that if you can have a whole section, so for me as a well engineer, just by looking at for example, the prognosis, the formation prognosis, I can already tell you where I preliminarily would like to set my casings, and that's prior to getting additional information on the pore pressure fracture gradient. Also important is the shoe strength, and of course the kick tolerance. That is really critical for determining the casing setting depth. So, in a nutshell, for a typical well, the selection of a casing string and of course the setting depth is based primarily on the pore pressure and the fracture gradients of in the course of this session. And also, in addition, I would like to highlight how important the pore pressure is in predicting the high pressure zones for which there could be risk of blowout. So that's very important for a well engineer to take note. So this is an example of the prognosis, the formation prognosis that I mentioned earlier, showing the different formations in terms of the sand that would be encountered for that will be intercepted by the trajectory, because right after the trajectory planning, the trajectory is sent back to the geologist, who then picks the tops or the formation tops for the formations that trajectory will be encountering. And like I said earlier, just by looking at the formation tops table, I can already preliminary give an idea of where I would be setting some of my casing strings. And of course, that will be refined as I get more information, especially on the pore pressure fracture gradient. So this is an example of the pore pressure fracture gradient graph. And like I said, this is very critical to the overall design of the well. It also drives the pore pressure and the fracture gradient also drives what we call the borehole stability recommended mod weight for areas that are prone borehole stability issues. So the pore pressure, significantly affects the well plan, and there might be several pressures classified according to, the magnitude of the pressures. You could have normal pressure zones, you could have abnormally pressured zones, the abnormally high pressured zones. You could also have subnormal zones. And in general, normal pressure zones do not create, planning issues. Where you would have major planning issues would be if you have highly abnormally pressured zones. Then you need to start thinking about how you set and where you set your different casing strings. Although for normal pressure zones, you could also have issues, especially if there are very deep wells, high temperature, really deep wells. That can also where you would set your casings. The fracture gradient, the fracture pressure is also very important to losses. So whatever whole section that we're going to be drilling, the strength of the shoe on that location can withstand the entire drilling end of that whole section. So the fracture pressure is the pressure at which at which in the well bore at which the formation will start to leak off. And sometimes this data can be gotten from leak off data. Offset wells, like I said earlier, offset wells help you to fill in the gaps in areas where you do not have sufficient data. So for a petrophysicist, information like the leak off test data from offset well will help him or her to better predict what the fracture gradients for the well would look like. So based on the fracture gradient, the pore pressure fracture gradient profile, we plan the well, or determine or refine, I would say, the casing setting depths. Sometimes well engineers start with the bottoms up approach. Some well engineers may start with a top down approach. So basically, saying how much can my formation take in terms of strength without reducing, without having an influx into the well for each whole section. And that's what drives the various casing setting depths from the bottom. Assuming you have an open hole if you're planning an open hole completion well with your last case, and in this case the 9 and 5/8 inch casing set just at the top of the reservoir, you can then draw your lines to find out what is the limit to which I can set my previous casing string without breaking the formation during the drilling process. And for this particular example, you see that we have 4 different casing strings based on the pore pressure fracture gradient graph. But the entire casing setting depth phase is still not complete, because you also need to take into account the borehole stability recommended mod weight for cases where you might have issues with the borehole with borehole stability in the area. So you would find out that even when you have moved to the next phase, which is the drilling fluid plan, find the setting depths for your casing strings. And what you have here is the same, is very, what you have here in this plot is just the same as what you have in the previous slide. The only difference is here we have the top pressure fracture gradient graph represented in absolute pressures, while for this case you have it represented in the PSI per foot, so in terms of the gradients itself, which is what will help us define the fluid plan for the well. So the blue line, so the yellow line is your pore pressure gradient, the red line is your fracture gradient, and then the blue line in between is the BHS, that's a borehole stability mod weight, which is the mod weight, the minimum mod weight required to drill through that entire section without having the well collapse in on you due to instability. So for a well engineer, you will not plan your well based on pore pressure if the region is prone to borehole stability issues. You will then have to refine your casing setting depths, or define your mod weights based on this borehole stability recommended mod weight. And for this, the borehole stability experts, or the geomechanical experts provides this recommended mod weight still based on offset well data, using the rock properties, the rock strength, using the pore pressure as well, and basically using that, including the Poisson's ratio, to be able to estimate what the borehole stability recommended mod weight is. Also important to highlight here as well is that the geomechanical expert also uses experiences from the drilling events from offset wells. So for example, the geomechanical experts could go into the drilling report for an offset well and see, oh, for this offset well, based on the offset well analysis, we experienced some tight spots here. Was this tight spot due to hole cleaning, poor hole cleaning, or was it due to pure borehole stability issues? And it's important that he or she is able to ascertain why we have those tight spots. Else, if the tight spot was due to borehole cleaning and he or she interprets it to be due to borehole stability issues, what you would find is an increase, in the borehole stability recommended mod weight to be able, in order to react to that drilling event from the offset well, which might also impact the entire design for the well and make the well a bit more complex, because you're using really high mod weights to drill through. So for this particular well, you'd see the different mod weights that have been recommended for the different hole sections. So for the 8.5-inch hole section, which is below the 9 and 5/8 inch shoe, would need a minimum of 0.55 psi per foot to be able to drill through safely without collapse. However, there's also a risk there. You'd find out that the fracture gradient intercepts that goes below that recommended mud weight. So a well engineer will have to take into account the risk of losses that could be encountered by using that recommended mud weight. So that's why it's really important that the geomechanical expert understands why there was a tight spot experienced in some of the offset wells. So we don't assume that is due to borehole stability. Meanwhile, it may have just been due to poor hole cleaning. And he builds that into his borehole stability recommended mud weight. So after that, on a high level, the cementing plan and some of the key things driving how we cement is basically the need to isolate zones with flow potential. This is really really critical to ensure that we on surface. So you see where the formation prognosis table comes into play again with the fluid prognosis in that table. So for me as a well engineer, I need to ensure that whatever top of cement that I have planned for the well completely isolates these zones that are hydrocarbon bearing. For the gas zones, which are much shallower, this is viewed as a shallow gas, and this and is viewed. Most of the things that drive the prediction as a shallow gas is that this gas can actually dissipate with time. So I don't necessarily need to. I would isolate the zone, but it will not drive where I set my casing depth. And then finally, high level. This is a final high level plan. In the past, actually, the drilling supervisors would use this one singular sheet to drill the well, surprisingly. But of course, that was in the days of very easy oil. But in these days where you have really complex wells, it's important that we then do a detailed design to fully do the hydraulics, understand the ECD requirements required to drill through safely. So for this high level plan, you find out that the well objectives are there. So the well objectives will be highlighted here. So it's important that we all understand that. You also see the wellbore trajectory planning. So you see the TVD, you see the along hole depth below drill floor according to the trajectory. You also see part of the risk in this front sheet, which is like a summary of the entire well plan. So the risk identified based on the offset well analysis is required to be on the sheet as well. And then you see the casing setting depths, yeah, on the sheet too. And then you see the drilling fluid plan telling you the weight of the fluid to be used to drill the a particular hole section. And then lastly, you see the cementing plan. So you see the top of cement, the planned top of cement for each casing. So with this, the well engineer now goes in to do a further detailed design, like I said earlier, for the hydraulics to ensure that we manage our ECDs properly. We have the right drilling parameters to safely drill the well. So I have just described, what I would call a one-dimensional well engineers siloed well planning process. Okay, from understanding the well objectives to the trajectory planning to the offset well analysis, the casing setting depths, the drilling fluid plan, the cementing plan, and then the actual detailed well design. But the reality is disciplines contributing to this entire process. Okay, and for understanding the well objectives, it's important that every member of the planning team understands the process from a multidisciplinary perspective and agree to a shared well well objectives. So we don't have conflicting priorities where the well engineer minimized cost or faster drilling, but the geologist is looking for, looking to align properly and target the proposed subsurface target. So these well objectives drives the entire decision making through the entire process. For the trajectory planning, I'd mentioned earlier the subsurface targets it's given by the geologist. We get the location map and the subsurface and the surface location from our geotechnical experts who are almost like surveyors as well, who are able to tell you which surface locations are the best locations to drill from. We have the offset well analysis. Like I mentioned, every member of this team actually utilizes offset well data to validate some of their assumptions made due to lack of data or data availability through the process. For the casing setting depth, the pore pressure, fracture gradient is important. The geohazards information, the formation prognosis is also important. And you see that these are provided by, various disciplines through the process. The drilling fluid plan is provided by the borehole stability data is provided by the borehole stability expert, which then drives the drilling fluid plan. And then we have the formation prognosis, which was earlier provided, still driving for the top of cements in order to isolate the hydrocarbon bearing zones. And then lastly, for the detailed design, we get what we call the data acquisition plan from the geophysicist, which helps further refine the data for subsequent wells or subsequent campaign. So for the data acquisition plan, you begin to look at what logs to take, and then you start looking at your BHAs, that your bottom hole assembly, what components should it contain in order to meet the data acquisition plan. Part of the reality is that this is a fully iterative process. I had mentioned that even within well engineering, as a well engineer, you are defining the casing setting depth. So what components should it contain? So what components should it contain? So you're designing your data. If I plan a subsurface location, do how much tolerance do we have to play with? And you find out that in reality, this process is not a one-dimensional process, but more of an iterative process. And it's important that an integration mindset is brought in when planning. We're running short of time, so I will just run through two different case studies showing how the objectives drove the behaviors of the team in addressing some of the constraints and the challenges that they had. There were some compromises made in the process, which is important to overall well-being process in ensuring that we keep a focus on what is most important. The well 2x was to replace an existing well. That existing well had sanded up, so there was a need, but then there were still some reserves left to be tapped. So the decision was made to drill a new well, which is this well 2x, to go and target the same reserves or the same location that the previous well, being well 2, had targeted. You would see here, of course, because of the need to target the same reserves, you would expect that the subsurface target location will be very close of well 2x, will be very close to well 2, thereby posing some collision risk for the well engineer. You would also see from a subsurface perspective, so this well is expected to produce with pressure support. So there's a planned injector. So a critical success factor for this well 2x would be for us to position it or place it in a region where it can get the required pressure support from its associated injector. And of course, for this location, for this particular well, you'd see here some kind of disconnect. I'm sure our geologists, partners here or friends would recognize the disconnect here. So there's a bit of a constraint with regards to insufficient net sand and connectivity between the injector and this producer, the well 2X. So one of the key things that drove success for us was the fact that the teams were very open and upfront with the constraint that they had. The well engineers had constraint with the collision risk. And of course, for this case, the collision was for up to 4 different wells. The first collision risk were due to close proximity to other wells, and then the subsequent collision risk was due to the initial well that was drilled in that area. So the team had to manage that constraint through the process. Also, understanding and aligning on the well objectives. What was critical was for us to um, target the original well for which we had lost the sanding up of the well. So that was the key thing that drove the team to then deviate from the norm. For a well engineer, you would want to have at minimum of 3.5 degrees dogleg, or that was the norm at the time. You will not find us having the 8.5 inch hole section being navigated. You would find an 8.5 inch hole section that is pretty smooth in the tangent section. But for this particular well, we had to change that in order to meet the objectives of the well. So you see this whole navigation through, which led to dogleg severity of up to 5 degrees, a different from the original norm of 2.5 degrees dogleg. So this was a success case, I would say. We met the well objectives in the midst of the constraints that the well engineers had, and it took just the intervention of somebody who was familiar with the geological constraints, what the business objectives were, to drive the team to go out of their comfort zone and begin to see how we can plan the trajectory to still meet the objectives of the entire well. The second case study is a case study of the well. It's just a bit brief in hindsight, where the as drilled well plan is such that it had 4 casings to it. We believed that there were some constraints in the way which were not fully communicated in the planning phase, and we basically over engineered this well. In hindsight, during a post well analysis, a 3-string casing scheme would have been sufficient for this well. And the key things that drove this suboptimal well design as drilled was the fact that the constraints were not transparent. If the constraint were transparent, we would have done a multi-scenario planning, having several trajectories, using the tolerance limits for the geology, and basically using that to have a better or an optimal well design. So this is a case where integration was not fully done, and the resulting well was a lot more expensive than it should have been, given what we know today. So in contributing to integration, it's, for that success case, remember I said it took the intervention of someone who had an understanding of the business objectives, had an understanding of the geological constraints, to get the well engineers to change the norm and begin to see how we can accept dogleg severities of up to 5 degrees per 100 feet. So it can be hard for someone who has been in drilling all their life, who doesn't have the right knowledge to properly challenge some assumptions to integrate fully throughout the well planning process. I would say in a bid to be experts, we need to ask ourselves if we have been too siloed as a discipline, whether it's as a well engineer or as a geologist or as a petrophysicist or even as a borehole stability expert. Key questions I ask myself constantly: why people are not challenging technical authorities or experts from other disciplines? Is it because we feel that we do not have the right knowledge or the basic understanding of the constraints of and risk faced by other experts to fully challenge them? But the key thing that I would say, that success to any integration approach to well planning is that challenge, that openness to accept the challenge, and the openness to go back and relook your assumptions. I had mentioned earlier that you could have a case where a petrophysicist or rather a borehole stability expert uses information from past drilling events, assuming that it was tight spots caused by borehole stability issues. Meanwhile, just by having a conversation with the well engineer, he or she would have understood that those tight spots could have been majorly due to poor hole cleaning, and hence he would not have to increase his mud weight in order to mitigate the risk of borehole instability. So constantly having that conversation. And then lastly is, what is the culture of our various organizations? Our organizations rotating their experts or their people across disciplines. In the beginning, I mentioned that I started off as a completions and well interventions engineer, and then now I'm doing more of a engineer or a well engineer's role. Now I can say that I have a basic knowledge of completions and even well engineering to comfortably challenge some of the assumptions that these disciplines have made. Even as a well engineer, I have a basic understanding of geology or petrophysics to fully challenge some of the assumptions that they have made as well. And vice versa, they challenge some of the assumptions that we have made. As a simple case is the case study, the success case study, where the well engineer thought that they couldn't drill wells that had more than 2.5-degree dogleg, but by a simple challenge we were able to see what was possible, and we now drill up to 5 degrees dogleg depending on what constraints that we are faced with. So I would ask us to, use this as a food for thought. How well are you reaching out to understand, the constraints or the contributions of other disciplines to your overall outcome? Because assumptions are assumptions, right? It's all subjective to whoever has basically made those assumptions. But if you fully understand how they contribute to your overall objective, then you can intelligently challenge some of those assumptions. I just put this here, to just show that integration becomes more important when we start moving away from the times of easy oil. Okay, so in the past, I had mentioned also that, with that singular front sheet, the drilling supervisor could comfortably drill the wells. But in these days where we have very complex geologies and complex well trajectories, it's quite difficult to just take on that single front sheet and go ahead and drill the wells. You have to consider some of the other constraints that other disciplines may be faced with for you to be able to successfully drill the wells. And for someone who has played Rubik's, you will understand that even when you think that all your yellows are aligned, for you to make your reds aligned, you may have to still switch the yellows again. That's where the iterative process comes in. So you could now imagine when you're now faced with very complex trajectories or geologies, how how challenging that might be. So there might be a need for you to constantly iterate the process until you get um, a good outcome that meets your overall well objectives. So I end by saying we're experts. The days of easy oil are over. So there's a need for us to change our approach for us to meet the objectives of the entire well planning process. And you find out that integration is an indirect value lever that organizations and experts like yourself can leverage to enhance the entire well planning outcome. And that would be the end for me. At this point, I would entertain questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Elesie, for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure the audience must have enjoyed it. We have one question in the chat box, but before I take that, I would like to ask a question. I want you to shed more light on what you defined an offset well to be.
Okay. All right. So basically an offset well is let me go back to that slide. That would better help in defining it. Okay. So I had used this diagram here to define what an offset well is. Okay.
Yeah.
Is these are wells that are similar to the proposed well that you're planning, in terms of either that those wells are in the same formation your the well that you're currently planning, or wells that are in the same location, maybe not necessarily intercepting exactly the locations that you will be the well that you're planning will be intercepting, but it could be that they are closer to the well that you will be planning. So in terms of geology, for a well that if you have wells that are in close proximity to each other, the likelihood that they will be intercepting the same geology would be the same. So the likelihood that whatever experiences you have in those offset well will also be experienced in the well that you're planning or you're proposing. There's a high likelihood that you would experience almost the same sort of drilling events, except if those are mitigated or managed properly. So you basically just select wells that are either in the same geology, intersecting the reservoir of interest, or wells that are in close proximity to the well that you plan. So that's basically where offset wells come in.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I would read out the second question, which is
Okay.
Nana asked this question. He says, in the, determining if a well will require sand control is a bit straightforward, but how do you anticipate the quantity of sand the well will produce without sand control? This is because sorry, some people tend to evaluate a
Mhm.
well's sand control efficiency without having a proper DST. They just drill, case,
Mm.
and complete. Sorry, before you answer that question, please, if you have any more questions, please drop it in the chat box. Thank you.
Okay. That's a fantastic question. Unfortunately, we didn't cover the completions aspect of it in this presentation. But yes, I'm not sure anybody would wait until they start producing sand. Maybe that was back in the days before they start knowing the quantity of sand that could be produced in the process, right? The key thing is doing a particle size distribution Okay, so if you understand the sizing and you understand that you do your screen, your sieve analysis, and you understand that you're in a geology that has a very loose formation, not competential. For example, a sandstone, automatically you know that a sandstone is prone to producing sand, right? But for a limestone, very rarely. Okay, so particle size distribution and sieve analysis is important for you to then ascertain if you will be producing sand. And of course, if you're going to be producing sand, the quantity does not matter. The key thing is for you to exclude that sand. Okay, by sizing either your screens, or if you're doing a gravel pack, by sizing your gravel to be able to ensure that you can exclude that. The sizing of the screens is really important. But the quantity of the sand that you're going to be producing, I don't know if there's any incident. That would be an interesting one to look at in the industry. If there was a case where you constantly produced sand until maybe your FPSO or your flow stations had a sand packed. The only area that I see that you may then produce sand, which was similar to one of the case studies that we looked at, was where your sand control mechanism failed. So your downhole sand control mechanism failed. So in that case, it's not like you haven't planned for sand control, but somehow due to maybe installation, the manner in which it was installed, or the fact that it wasn't sized properly, you then have sands coming into your well bore. It's also important to highlight that, because we also have this debate sometimes. Sands and fines are completely different. Your sand control mechanism is not designed to control fines. Okay, so various sand control strategies will then drive how much fines you produce. Okay, compared to sand. Sand, I don't think you're set out to know the quantity of sand that you would produce. Instead, that would be for fines.
Okay, thank you very much. Nana, I hope she was able to answer your questions. If not, you can leave a message in the chat box. So more questions have come in while you were answering that. So the next question is from Roshan, and he says, what if there are no offset wells and you are drilling a wildcat well? Then our data is very
Mm,
limited. How how
mhm.
do we plan for that? Very good one.
Yeah, that's a very good that's a very good question, actually. So for wildcat wells, analogs are important, I would say. I think analog wells are important, but then also for the offsets, for you to then plan, it means you then have to build in several contingencies into your overall well planning process, I would think.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. I hope your question has been answered,
Because
Roshan.
yes, because yeah, I hope that helped, because really wildcat wells are exploration wells. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's understandable that you have very limited information to help you to plan that entire process. So building in contingencies, and I'm sure even within the region you might have some wells, or some regions that may be similar in terms of geology. I think my geologist friends will be able to better answer this particular questions. Just like the Niger Delta, you have, even though the Niger Delta is a geological region, I would think. So even if you don't have a well, an offset well, particularly in Port Harcourt, you might have an offset well in in Lagos or somewhere, but the geology of the entire place in terms of the depositional environment is sort of the same. So you begin to look for fields that have the same sort of depositional environment as the field that you're planning to drill the white cat well, and use that as a basis to perform your offset well analysis.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much. I guess that answers Roshan's question. The next question is from David, and he says, in your case study one, you mentioned that well times two was drilled because well 2x rather was drilled because well two had sand issues. Was the possibility of an
Mhm.
intervention considered instead of drilling a fresh well, especially in terms of the economics
Yeah.
and cost savings?
hmm No, that's a very good question. So for us, it was a peculiar case because we had started drilling very cheap wells. Okay, so when you consider the intervention required to, in fact, the entire sand control mechanism failed. The entire well was sanded up when we first tried an intervention, but when we evaluated it further, we discovered that to even intervene and would I say scoop out the sand was a lot more expensive than having to drill a completely new well. And of course, the risk and the escalation in terms of cost for the well intervention was a lot more than the drilling of a new well, which we had started drilling really, really cheap wells as a result of our integrated approach. So we decided to go with a new well completely.
Okay, to add to that question from David, we have Julius also asking continuation of David's question. Why not consider a sidetrack of the same well too with minimal AFE than going for a fresh well?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Something else I did not add was that another thing, because you also have to look at why did we have the sand production apart from the failure of the sand control mechanism. It was also believed that the well two was not positioned properly. It was positioned in a poorly developed sand area. Okay, so that was another critical thing that drove us to drill a completely new well. And in terms of the sidetrack, having the sidetrack well to target the new location, which was still closer to well two, resulted in a very complex well. So you see that for this particular well, you'd see here we had four casing strings. So for us to be able to drill a side well, we'll have to go and cut the 13, in fact, start off with the 9 and 5/8 inch casing, pull that out, running with our milling assembly, set the whipstock, and then mill through the casing. Like I said, one of the key things that drove our decision was the fact that we were getting better, we were better at drilling completely new wells compared to intervening or performing sidetrack. So for your own organization, it might be a completely different setup. It might be that for drilling new wells are a lot more expensive for you. In the past, we had sidetracks, but then those sidetracks had cost escalations. Once you start having one sidetrack, we would have sidetrack one, sidetrack two, sidetrack three. So the team were not keen on moving with a sidetrack approach compared to a new well.
Okay, thank you for
I
that.
don't know if there's any more questions. So I will have to I just have just 1 minute because I have another meeting. I have a hard stop at 1. So maybe we'll take one more
Oh,
question,
okay.
and of course I can drop my email if you have any more questions. Please feel free to reach me, and we can continue the conversation.
Okay. Apparently, I'll just read out the last two questions and then you can answer us in a minute thereabout. So We have
Okay.
one from Gibson that says, how can losses be managed when drilling across a fault zone? And another from Oluwasegun that says, what is dogleg severity? And as a geoscientist and I have interest in drilling, what can I do? That's all.
Okay. Okay. I unfortunately, if we start going into fault drilling, we wouldn't leave here today. So my apologies. Please reach me. I don't know who asked the question. Please reach me on my email, and we'll take the conversation further. I'm actually late for my meeting now, but dogleg severity is simply how much we turn in layman's term, how much we turn, the degree of turn or the degree of build over 100 feet interval through your entire well planning or the drilling process. And the question you asked, oh, how can you as a geoscientist or was it a geologist get involved? It's simply, you're a geologist, but don't end at being a geologist. Ask the well engineer. So if I give you this target, what is the impact? Okay, I have this target tolerance. How will that influence your trajectory or your overall well design? It's about reaching out and having that investigative mindset, not just ending at your own expertise, but reaching out and just finding out the challenges and the risk that others are exposed to. And that will open up your mind to even change your own approach in terms of how you give them your subsurface target. For a well engineer, one single point does not make sense. It's always good to have tolerance to which the drilling engineer can plan around.
Okay. Thank you very much, Elesie, for
Okay.
this webinar session. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to Karen.
Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation. Integration is one area that I'm quite passionate about, and I know the impact that integration can bring to the overall well planning process. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to me via the email that I posted in the chat
Yeah,
box.
so the email is in the
Fortunately,
chat
I'll
box.
have to leave. Yes, I will have
Okay.
to leave now. Thanks, Adaku and Karen for having me as part of this session.
Thank you too. Thank you too.
Okay.
For
Okay.
every
All
other
right.
person, the email is in the chat box and the YouTube link is also in the chat box. The recording is going to be on YouTube and you can send Elesie an email anytime. Thank you very much for attending this session. Karen,
Okay, great job, Adaku. Thank you very much for facilitating this session. Elesia has gone, but my thanks to her too for accepting the session. Everybody that joined in, thank you as well. So the announcement I'm supposed to make is we're already break, but for those that, but for those of us that went then, uh, we are the EAGE Nigerian Young Professionals, and follow us on all our social media pages to be aware of all our activities. And like I mentioned earlier, we have a couple coming up. We have one for the 17th of October, and you don't want to miss out. The recording session will not available. However, the recording will be uploaded on our YouTube page. There's a playlist on anything you want to catch up to you can subscribe as well so you're aware of all our recordings, special shrooms coming up. Thanks again, everyone. Time is fast spent. Have a great day ahead, and I look forward to seeing you all in more activities. Cheers.
thank you too. Bye.